Welcome back, Jerry.
Hey Jason, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm awesome, man.
Glad
Awesome.
to hear it. Okay, so Zero Trust Architecture is part two. Um, in the previous video, we kind of teed this up. We talked about the components of the Zero Trust policy model very briefly. We talked about the different types of policy enforcement points. And now we're really ready to dive into the heart of the chapter where we have these four different Zero Trust deployment models. And what we're doing with these is we're depicting them pictorially, recall, and for each of them, we're analyzing them for the pros and cons. And one of the things I think that we both, it's a challenge for us, but I know it's a real challenge for the enterprise security architects out there, which is that, of course, there's not just four deployment models, there's 40 and shades of gray in between. So it's really, really hard. It's hard for us. It was hard for us in the book to come up with something that was sensible and had a reasonable number and yet is representative of reality. So, it seems like every day or every week, there's a new vendor in a zero trust space or a new architecture that's doing really new and interesting things. And that's awesome, but it also makes for a very complex and fast moving space. So I think this little bit of a preamble is a way of saying we have these four models and we think that they're very sound and they represent, four kind of slightly overlapping areas. They have good pros and cons, but when you as an architect are looking at an actual vendor or an actual architecture that you're putting together, keep in mind that the analysis that we put together is really a starting point and that the actual implementations you look at will have their own set of pros and cons, which will probably overlap with one of these four models, but not exactly. Some of these vendors might have additional pros, they might have additional cons, they might have eliminated some of the cons. There's a lot of interesting things. And I think it's a testament to the necessity for you as an architect and with your security and networking team to really deeply understand how these vendors are approaching things and how they'll work in your environment. And this is hard stuff. I work with customers every day, and so does Jerry. And sometimes it's these nitty-gritty things like network routing or overlapping IP addresses or DNS that cause headaches and can sometimes be more of an impediment than you think. Jerry, do you have any upfront comments before we dive in here? We're going to talk about resources.
Yeah, and I think that, obviously you nailed all that. And I just to append to that or add some additional color, I think that, every one of these are, they're very unique and they are common and you're going, as Jason said, there's some overlaps on these. And I absolutely think as an architect, you're going to start thinking about this from a manageability perspective. You're going to start thinking of this from a hybrid model, and then something that I talk about a lot is how are you going to implement some of these from a resource focused perspective, right? Because some resources are different than other resources, and so it really becomes how do I implement as it suits to my business needs. So as an architect, that's some of the things you're really going to have to take into consideration as we start going through these deployment models. Understand the resource, understand your business model, and quite frankly, know that you're not limited to one. Right, that's something to keep in mind. You're absolutely going to have a hybrid or some combination of these potential deployment models, or anything else that as Jason said, a vendor brings their architecture and their technology into the conversation.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. Is that vendor architectures that have gotten more mature very often have different types of enforcement points and different types of mechanisms that they can deploy on the networks to let you have one or more of these architectures, these deployment models, or even things that blur the line between them. So again, I think these models are a good starting point, but are clearly not written in stone and the end of the story. It's an ongoing story.
I say it's always been an evolution, Jason.
Indeed. And every day I learn something new, so it keeps you humble.
It does.
Okay, so let's dive in and let's first talk about the resource-based deployment model. And for calling this model, again, we're depicting a local agent, a user agent policy enforcement point on the user's device, just for simplicity and because in most architectures, that's a fairly typical way that users are accessing these resources. Of course, that's not always a necessity. In many, many cases, vendors and solutions have clientless options. On the right-hand side of the diagram, of course, there's a policy enforcement point that sits right in front of or is part of the resource itself. And as Jerry mentioned, there's lots of different types of resources. So this could be a software component that runs in the same operating system as a resource. It could be part of a platform as a service cloud environment that's attached to it. It could be some sort of sidecar in a containerized cluster, or there could be other types of enforcement points. But let's talk about this model where the enforcement point sits right in front of or as part of the resource itself. You want to kick things off, Jerry, in terms of pros and cons and approaches around this?
Yeah, when you start thinking about this, really, you're talking about limiting the implicit trust zone, if you will, to the single resource, whatever that resource happens to be. And as you start building this out, what this is going to really provide you is a capability to understand what's happening at that resource level, right? I talk a lot about protecting the resource at the resource level, and that's exactly what this model is doing. It's bringing that PEP as a part of that. Some of the things, though, that you want to consider is manageability, right? In the preface of this, I said manageability is something to consider. And while this gives you that visibility at the resource level, which absolutely you want in your environment, it also creates a potential management issue because you could proliferate these PEPs across your organizations. Let's just say our resources at the network level. And if you start thinking about, well, I'm going to protect servers at the network level, so my PEP sits on my server, it sits in front of that server, and so forth. So what ends up happening there is now you've got all these PEPs across your organization. I recently used the example: if you have 1,500 servers and this is the only model you're running, you potentially have 1,500 resources or PEPs to manage to enforce this, which in maybe 1,500 is not a large number, but if you're at 50,000, that's a large number. I don't know what you think, Jason.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And it also runs in potential for both technical and political conflict for traditional applications. So if this is a traditional app that's running on an operating system, by definition, the PEP needs to be part of the operating system image. And in many cases, you might get some pushback from application owners. There might be some technical conflicts. Maybe it's an older operating system, or maybe there's some sensitivity around this and there's resistance to having the PEP part of that. Different deployment models, of course, may not suffer from that. The other thing to keep in mind is that the user, of course, may be and will in many cases be physically remote and need to access those resources across a wide area network or the internet even. So you have to understand in the vendor architecture, the vendor solution you've chosen, how is that remote access handled? You certainly don't want to have, in Jerry's example, 1,500 of these resources all exposed to the internet. There are mechanisms that some vendors use and some nice advanced networking concepts that allow, in many cases, or in some cases, some of these solutions to transit DMZ firewalls without having to have an open port. But in some cases, that's not the case. And clearly you want to steer away from having these things exposed to the internet for obvious reasons.
I was just sitting here thinking about this, and I talk about this model quite a bit when I start thinking about legacy softwares, legacy applications, legacy solutions that an organization has to protect. And I think it's a fantastic model in those regards, because it gives you capability to protect resources that may not be native to a zero trust architecture, or may not be native in a zero trust architecture, but to place something in front of that to support that. I could get into details of that, but I know we could, you and I could talk about this for the next 2 hours, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's talk about the next one, which is the enclave-based deployment model. And this is one of the two most common models that we've seen out there. And the reason, of course, is that it immediately addresses some of the concerns that you mentioned, Jerry, around scale and around remote access. So in this model, of course, the PEP is network separated from the resource that it's protecting. And there's a resource enclave of N resources that the PEP is acting as a gateway to control access into those. So this allows organizations to do two things. One is there's absolutely zero changes that are needed to the actual resources themselves, which can be really easy to do from technical or political perspective. And it also allows the PEP in this case to be internet exposed. It can be deployed in the DMZ. It can be accessed over the internet with a variety of safeguards around that. And it therefore directly and in a pretty straightforward way allows the zero trust solution to have remote access built in. Jerry, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, you nailed all the big points. The only thing I would caution on this, right? This does create that implicit trust zone. This creates a larger zone that you need to be concerned about, and where there may be specific communications that take place internal to that implicit trust zone that you ultimately have to trust. That would be the only thing I'd really add to this. But as you said, Jason, it's definitely something to. It's a common deployment model because there's manageability, it's functionality. There's things you don't necessarily have to change at the application or at the resource level to support it. But my only tale of caution, if you will, is knowing that you have that implicit trust zone and knowing that once you're in that implicit trust zone, that traffic or those access requests or whatever are trusted.
Right. And I think as long as people are doing that thoughtfully and they recognize that, then I really view this as a feature and not a bug of this model. Because I've seen many customers, many organizations deliberately, they start with this model and they say, we want to focus on user access. So we're going to have a pretty large implicit trust zone. And the biggest problem and the biggest risk we have is around user access. So it's okay if they get access, if they're not going to get access to all the resources in the implicit trust zone. Obviously, the policy model will give them fine-grained control of that. But the security team makes a trade-off and says, okay, we need to solve the user access problem here. We're going to have this fairly large implicit trust zone, and that's okay because maybe it's under control or maybe it's a little bit unknown and they have more work to do. And it's a good step 2 or step 3 in their journey, whereas users are very often step 1 of the journey because they're much, much riskier.
Yeah.
All right. So let's talk now about the cloud routed deployment model, which is the other of the 2 most common scenarios. So we've seen many vendors that offer cloud-based services, whether they're secure web gateways or CASBs or things like that, add in a zero trust network access that follows this model. So clearly the value of it is that it's part of a managed service, or I should say as a service offering. There are still PEPs that are deployed inside the enterprise that follows the resource enclave model. So it's very, very similar in many ways to the enclave-based model that we talked about. In some ways, this can be a little simpler to deploy because almost without exception, in these models, the on-premises PEP in the resource enclave makes an outbound request or outbound connection to the vendor managed cloud. So there are no inbound ports or inbound connections that are necessary. The disadvantage is, of course, that the traffic from the user has to go up into the vendor cloud, transit the vendor cloud, and then go back down. So it adds latency, and it very, very often imposes additional restrictions in terms of network protocols that are supported, and very often doesn't support server-initiated connections down to a user's device. Jerry, your thoughts?
Yeah, the one thing that I'll highlight that you called out that I think is just really important when you start thinking about this type of model is that outside in or the inside out communication as opposed to the outside in communication, which, you know, in some of the scenarios we talk about later in the book and use cases around VPN replacement and those types of things is a great opportunity for this type of model, because what you're not doing is exposing some of those endpoints or public IPs or those types of things to the internet, and what you really just get is secure tunnel. But to your point, there's absolutely that latency where you're going into the cloud and back down into the services that support it. That's exactly. Yep.
And in some areas, especially in some smaller countries, that can be a problem. We
Right.
work with a number of enterprises who are in Africa, and in those cases, you know, they can't accept this model because the traffic would go from users in their country out, you know, across hundreds or thousands of miles in some cases to a data center and then back down into their country. And they need to have better control of the network topologies that things stay in country. Some other areas of the world have data residency requirements as well, and they want to keep things in country. So that's another consideration.
Absolutely. No, absolutely.
All right, let's talk about the last one, which is microsegmentation. Do you want to kick things this one off, Jerry?
Yeah, I mean, I think this one, this is an interesting one because it takes in my opinion, it takes that resource model we talked about in the beginning and really starts tying down resources at the resource level, right? But it also makes that resource a sub or a requester or a subject. Because now what's happening is in a microsegmentation model, the resources are making requests, the users are making a request, everyone's making a request. And it's not just an inside out conversation. This could also, from a manageability perspective, as an enterprise architect, you want to consider, what does this mean to your organization? How are you ultimately going to manage this? And then move forward with this as a potential security model. Again, I think it goes back to that hybrid conversation. Jason, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, this is, I think that I don't think there would typically be a pure microsegmentation model that enterprises would deploy, because even in our simple diagram, we're showing a user with access to that. And obviously the user is a different type of subject than the resources themselves. And in many cases, there will be a mixture of, probably a mixture of models where you might have an enclave-based model of the PEP in front of a number of resources and some other number, potentially a larger number of resources that follow this model here, where each individual resource is both an authenticated, identified subject as well as a resource. This model, I think, lends itself well for probably DevOps or containerized workloads where you are driving everything through automation, because that's really the only way to manage this at scale. If you've got hundreds or thousands of resources and containerized workloads that no one's going to be configuring those things manually, it's all going to be driven by code or by metadata. This thing can work really, really well as long as the security team gets buy-in from the application team. It can be part of a really powerful DevOps platform of which this type of integrated security is an inherent part of it, and can really help organizations kind of let their developers focus on application logic and use this really powerful platform that they've built out. So I think there's a lot of really interesting things that we'll see around in this arena and this model as more and more organizations adopt service meshes, and as those policy models start to evolve and somehow align with other zero trust deployment models outside of the mesh itself. And that's definitely uncharted territory for us.
No, I 100% agree. And I think the service mesh is a perfect example of that. And rather than, I tell clients, rather than trying to go in and Jason, you and I have talked about this, rather than telling clients to go in and let's break up that service mesh and try to do something in there that's difficult, because it already does it fairly well. I know we talk about this in chapter 16, I believe. But it's certainly something to consider, and how this deployment model is utilized.
Exactly. So plenty more to talk about here. I think that we'll wrap this up. In these two videos, we clearly covered, we talked about the elements of the zero trust architecture as well as the 4 deployment models. And I think we provide a really good set of ingredients, if you will, and a starting point for these 4 models. And clearly, in your environment and the architectures that you choose, there's going to be a lot of overlap. So keep that in mind. Any closing thoughts from you, Jerry?
Yeah, I would just say, as you think about these deployment models, don't think of them in a vacuum, because it doesn't work. Think of them in a hybrid mode, and how does it really fit your business? How does it fit what you're trying to cover? How does it fit in your architecture? So as an enterprise architect, you really need to consider, what is it we're trying to accomplish here? And then, something I'm very passionate about is, how is it protecting the resource that you're trying to protect? And how do you, which model fits best for that resource and that critical asset as you move forward?
Great. Thanks for the comments, Jerry. So this has been good, and we're looking forward to seeing you again next time. Thank you.
Thank you.